Mrs. Eleanor Vance's grand library was a carefully curated blend of lemon polish, old leather, and the silent, suffocating weight of money. It was a room where masterpieces hung on the walls and first editions slept on the shelves, a temple built to the god of excess. That evening, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that made the room feel both warm and menacing. Around a low table, Mrs. Vance and her equally wealthy friends laughed, their voices sharp and brittle as breaking glass. In the corner, almost invisible, a woman named Sarah moved with practiced silence, refilling wine glasses, her presence acknowledged only by its absence. Her son, 10-year-old Leo, sat on a small stool near the hallway, a place he was meant to be seen but not heard. He was waiting for his mother's shift to end, his small hands clutching a worn copy of a book. But his eyes were not on the pages. They were fixed on the centerpiece of the room, a magnificent, hand-carved ivory and obsidian chessboard that sat on a marble table, the pieces arranged as if frozen in a battle of gods. For Leo, it wasn't a game. It was a universe. Mrs. Vance noticed his gaze. A slow, cruel smile spread across her face. She loved casual displays of power, small moments of theater where she was the unquestioned director. "Sarah," she called out, her voice cutting through the chatter. Sarah froze, her heart instantly seizing with a familiar dread. "Your boy seems fascinated by the board. Does he know what it is?" He's seen it before, ma'am. Just looking." "Nonsense," Mrs. Vance declared, a wicked glint in her eye. "Let's have some sport. Mr. Henderson has tired me out with his talk of stocks. Boy, come here. You will play me a game."
The laughter from the guests was polite but sharp with condescension. The invitation was not an act of kindness, it was a joke, a performance designed to entertain her friends at the expense of her maid's son. Sarah felt a hot flush of shame and fear creep up her neck. She wanted to refuse, to pull Leo away and hide him, but to refuse an order from Eleanor Vance was unthinkable. It meant dismissal, poverty, a world of uncertainty. "Ma'am, he's just a child," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "He wouldn't know how to play against you." "Oh, I'll go easy on him," Mrs. Vance purred, waving a dismissive hand. "Come, boy, don't be shy." Leo stood up. He did not look scared. He did not look angry. His face was a mask of calm, quiet observance. He walked to the marble table and sat in the large leather chair opposite the most powerful woman he had ever known. His small feet didn't even touch the cold marble floor. His mother stood in the corner, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white, whispering a silent prayer. "Please, God, let this end quickly. Let her be merciful." Mrs. Vance made her first move with a flick of her wrist, pushing her queen's pawn forward 2 spaces. A standard, solid opening. She leaned back, a smirk on her lips, expecting the boy to stare blankly or make a clumsy, random move. Leo looked at the board for a long moment. The world outside the 64 squares seemed to melt away. He reached out a small, steady hand and moved his king's pawn forward 2 spaces. It was an answer, a challenge. The game began. Mrs. Vance played with careless, lazy arrogance, her moves designed to be flashy and aggressive. She was not trying to win, she was trying to humiliate. Leo's responses were quiet, simple, and defensive. He was a small boat weathering a storm. The guests began to grow bored, the joke wearing thin. Then, on the 6th move, it happened. Mrs. Vance, having developed her knight, left a subtle opening, a trap for an amateur. She expected Leo to take the bait. Instead, Leo ignored the trap entirely. He moved his bishop to a square that seemed passive, almost weak. One of Mrs. Vance's guests, a man who fancied himself a player, chuckled. "The boy has no stomach for a fight, Eleanor." Mrs. Vance smiled, preparing to close her trap on the next move. But as she reached for her piece, she stopped. Her eyes traced the line of Leo's bishop. It wasn't a defensive move. It wasn't weak. It was a laser beam, a perfectly aimed threat at the heart of her position. It didn't just counter her trap, it laid a far more sophisticated one of its own. The condescending smile on Eleanor Vance's face vanished. Her eyes narrowed. She looked up from the board and stared at the small, silent boy sitting opposite her. For the first time that night, she truly saw him, and in his calm, unblinking gaze, she saw no fear. She saw a king staring back at her from across a battlefield he already commanded. The joke was over, and a terrifying, silent war had just begun. The air in the library grew suddenly cold. The unconcerned batter of the guests died away, replaced by a thick, watchful silence. They all saw it, the instant the mask of bored amusement on Eleanor Vance's face dissolved into something else. A flicker of disbelief, quickly followed by a flash of raw, indignant fury. A servant's child was not supposed to be intelligent. He was supposed to be a prop, a source of easy entertainment. He was not supposed to fight back. Mrs. Vance did not acknowledge the boy's brilliant move. To do so would be to admit the game was real. Instead, she dismissed it with a flick of her wrist, making a different, safer move. "A lucky guess," she said to her friends, her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. "Even a blind squirrel finds a nut occasionally." But it wasn't a guess. Sarah knew it from her corner of the room, her heart a wild bird in her chest. She had seen this before. Leo didn't play chess, he breathed it. He'd learned the game from an old discarded book he'd found, studying the diagrams of famous matches by candlelight in their small room. He would play out entire games in his head, his fingers tracing invisible moves on his blanket. He had a mind that saw the world in patterns, in cause and effect, in silent, calculated warfare. She had never told a soul. A smart boy was a dangerous thing on a plantation. In a place like this, it was just as perilous. The game continued. The mood had shifted irrevocably. This was no longer a joke, it was a duel. Mrs. Vance, her pride now deeply wounded, abandoned her lazy, aggressive style. She began to play with a cold, vicious precision. Every move she made was a threat, a dagger aimed at Leo's defenses. She was no longer trying to humiliate him, she was trying to crush him. The ivory and obsidian pieces now moved across the board like armies, the soft click of their placement echoing like cannon fire in the silent room. Leo met her assault with an unnerving calm. For every attack he had a defense, for every threat a counter. He was no longer a small boat in a storm, he was a fortress, its walls built of logic and foresight. He played with an economy of motion, his small hand moving with a certainty that was terrifying to watch. He never looked at Mrs. Vance. His entire world was the 64 squares in front of him. The guests were no longer bored, they were captivated, leaning forward in their chairs, their wine glasses forgotten. They were witnessing the impossible. A 10-year-old boy, the son of a maid, was not only holding his own against Eleanor Vance, a notoriously sharp and competitive player, he was controlling the game. Sarah could barely breathe. Every move felt like a step on a tightrope. She could see the storm clouds gathering on Mrs. Vance's face. The woman's jaw was clenched, a muscle twitching in her cheek. This wasn't just about a game of chess anymore. It was about power. It was about the natural order of things, an order this small, silent boy was systematically dismantling with every move he made. Then, Mrs. Vance made a crucial mistake. Driven by her frustration and her burning need to end the game, she launched an all-out attack with her queen, sacrificing a lesser piece to create what she believed was an unstoppable path to Leo's king. It was a bold, powerful move, a queen's gambit fueled by rage. She slammed the piece down, a triumphant smirk returning to her lips. Check! The room held its breath. It looked like the end. Leo's king was trapped, with only one or two moves to escape, each one leading to another, more deadly attack. Sarah closed her eyes. It was over. The humiliation would be swift. But Leo didn't move his king. His eyes scanned the board for a full 30 seconds, a silent eternity. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached for his rook, a piece on the other side of the board, seemingly uninvolved in the battle. He slid it one square forward. The move made no sense. It did nothing to save his king. It was so illogical, so completely unexpected, that one of the guests let out a small, confused laugh. "What is that?" the man said. "The boy has finally cracked. He's abandoned his king." Mrs. Vance stared at the move, a frown creasing her brow. She saw what the guest saw, an irrelevant, meaningless move, a surrender. She reached out her hand to take his king and end the game. But her hand stopped, hovering over the board. Her eyes widened, the blood drained from her face. The room was utterly silent. They all saw it now. Leo's move had not been a surrender. It had been a revelation. By ignoring the immediate threat to his own king, he had sprung a hidden, far more devastating trap. He had sacrificed his defense to launch a silent, unstoppable counterattack. It was a move of such breathtaking genius and cold-blooded nerve that it felt less like a chess move and more like an assassination. Mrs. Vance slowly pulled her hand back from the board. She looked at her king, so proud and safe just a moment ago, now a prisoner awaiting his execution. Then she looked at the 10-year-old boy. He finally lifted his gaze from the board and looked directly at her. And in a voice that was quiet, clear, and devoid of any triumph, he said, "Checkmate." The word hung in the air, as sharp and as final as the drop of a guillotine. Checkmate. For a long moment, the only sound in the grand library was the crackling of the fire. The guests were frozen, their faces a mixture of shock, awe, and a dawning, uncomfortable fear. The joke had curdled, the night's light entertainment had become a chilling demonstration of power, and the power was not where it was supposed to be. Mrs. Eleanor Vance did not move. She stared at the board, her mind refusing to accept the reality of the 64 squares. She traced the lines of attack and defense, searching for an escape, a flaw, a single move the boy might have overlooked. But there was none.
The trap was perfect. Her king was dead. It had been executed by a 10-year-old child who, an hour ago, she hadn't even considered a person. Sarah, watching from the corner, felt a wave of terror so profound it almost buckled her knees. This was not a victory. This was a catastrophe. Her son had not just won a game of chess. He had shattered a sacred, unspoken rule. He had proven himself to be superior. In this house, in this world, there was no greater crime. She expected an explosion of rage, a chair being thrown, a stream of venom directed at her and her son. But the explosion never came. Instead, something far more terrifying happened. Mrs. Vance leaned back in her chair, a strange, unreadable smile touching her lips. The fury in her eyes was gone, replaced by a gaze that was cold, analytical, and predatory. It was the look a scientist gives a fascinating but dangerous new specimen. "Well," she said, her voice a soft, silken purr that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "It seems we have a prodigy in our midst." She turned her gaze to her stunned guests. "Isn't he remarkable?" The guests, taking their cue from her, began to applaud. It was a strange, stilted applause, full of a nervous energy. They praised Leo's skill, calling him a genius, a marvel. But their words were hollow, their smiles brittle. They were trying to reclaim the moment, to frame it as their discovery, to turn the boy from a threat back into an amusing pet. Mrs. Vance stood up. "Sarah," she said, her voice now dripping with a false, saccharine sweetness. "Your boy has a rare gift, a gift that must be nurtured." She walked over to Leo, who still sat silently in his chair, his face unreadable. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch feeling less like a gesture of kindness and more like an act of ownership. "We will have to arrange for a proper tutor. He will play in tournaments. He will be my protégé." Sarah's blood ran cold. She understood immediately. This wasn't a reward. It was a punishment. It was a cage, more gilded, but just as strong as any other. Mrs. Vance would not let him go. She would own his genius, display it like one of her priceless paintings, and take credit for it. He would be her clever little toy, a constant living reminder to everyone of her magnanimity. He would be trapped by her kindness, a prisoner of his own brilliant mind.
"It's late," Sarah said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Leo needs to get home. We have an early morning." She was trying to pull him back, to save him from the gilded cage that was closing around him. Mrs. Vance's smile tightened. "Of course," she said, "but from tomorrow, things will be different. We have great plans for you, Leo." As Sarah led her son out of the grand library and into the cool, dark night, she could feel the weight of every eye on their backs. The door closed behind them, shutting out the world of leather and lies. Leo was silent for the entire walk home. Sarah's heart was breaking. She wanted to tell him he should have lost, that he should have hidden his light, but she couldn't. How do you tell your child to be less than what they are? When they finally reached their small, humble room, Leo turned to her. He looked up at her, and for the first time since the game began, she saw the 10-year-old boy again. His eyes were wide with a question she could not answer. "Mama," he said, his voice a small, quiet whisper, "did I do something wrong?" Sarah knelt down and pulled him into a fierce, desperate hug, burying her face in his hair. She held him tightly, the silent, brilliant, endangered son she had brought into a world that had no place for him. "No, baby," she whispered, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. "You did everything right." And as she held him, she knew the game was far from over. It had simply moved to a new board, a much larger and more dangerous one. On this board, the pieces were not made of ivory and obsidian, but of pride, power, prejudice, and a mother's unshakable love. And she would be damned if she let Eleanor Vance make the next move.